Watchers call. Whispers from the eternal void.
I recorded the first impossibility before our boots cooled on the deck plating. Human skin had been stretched across a cogitator's display face, like vellum over parchment, sutured into the input ports with surgical precision, and it breathed. The epidermis wept luminous machine oil from its pores, while Benharic prayers poured forth in wet, papery whispers. The machine spirit beneath answered not in blessed mechanical cant, but in low Gothic through blackened vox grills. "Welcome home, Magos Cade." That broke a rule so fundamental to my order that my first response was not speech, but the bitter taste of bile and the reflexive recitation of denial litanies under my respirator. Flesh is weak, pattern is pure. My designation is Row 7 Cade, biologist errant of the Lathes, and bond retainer to the Ordo Hereticus. We had come as a joint kill team to Basilica Forge Soteria, suspended in the ash clouds above Volunda Secundus, answering a distress code that reeked of techno-sorcery. The strike cruiser Absolver maintains our leash at 47,000 kilometers, cyclonic torpedoes armed and targeted. 18 hours until sterilization. The noospheric quarantine lattice was already hemorrhaging data when we breached the hull. The station's auspex burned my augmetics with false positive readings, showing green where no human minds remained. Telemetry cascaded across my visor in brittle runes. Mission timer. 18 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds, and counting. Quarantine integrity. 47% and falling in measured increments. Temperature variance. -12 to +46 Celsius in regular pulses. Audio anomaly. 13-beat chime sequence. Deep origin. Repetition interval 57 seconds. I felt each chime before hearing it. Pressure behind the sternum. A rhythmic suggestion that my implants attempted to synchronize with. I manually spiked the connection and spoke the rite of disjunction across SquadVox. Maintain independent cadence. Do not march, breathe, or pray in step with the ambient patterns. Inquisitor Vale stalked ahead through Dock Spindle Vortheta, her storm cloak stiff with frost rime that formed and sublimated with each pulse of the station's breathing. 2 Skitari Rangers ghosted flanking positions, galvanic rifles tracking shadows that bent wrong around corners that should not exist. A chirurgeon servitor trundled behind, its cart armatures chattering like mandibles. The atmosphere itself schemed against us. Arctic drafts knifed from ruptured coolant stacks, fogging our breath in sheets, while humid warmth condensed as grease on Auspex lenses, smearing tactical data like oil on glass. The skin-wrapped cogitator continued its impossible liturgy. The Benharic was not clean metallic code burst, but the wet patter of a child reciting catechism through gauze, logic syllogisms dampening the consonants. The machine replied again in that unplaceable low Gothic voice. "Blessed be the pattern that consumes." Vale's gaze flicked to me, her tone iron without ornament, diagnosis, magos. "Illicit biomechanical interfacing," I reported, palming a sanctified scalpel. "Heresy under Ordnance Hecatomb Sigma, also impossible." I touched the skin's edge, warmth, turgor, capillary refill beneath suture lines. A tattoo ringed the input sockets in familiar geometry. The 8-toothed cog nested within 13 ribs. The number made my ventricles stutter. The chime tolled again, 13 thuds that were heartbeats transduced through metal. The skin's pores dilated as if listening. We advanced past manufactorums where assembly lines had grown into intestinal architectures, conveyor systems pulsing with peristaltic rhythm. Servo skulls drifted overhead in formations that traced sigils, not the blessed 8-pointed cog, but something with 13 teeth, 13 spokes, 13 spaces between. When I attempted to record the pattern, my cogitator rejected the data with error codes I had never encountered. The recurring whisper began then, bleeding from speakers that should carry only shift announcements. Flesh is weak. Pattern is pure. But the emphasis fell wrong, transforming sacred catechism into something that crawled beneath my augmetic skin. The phrase repeated every 13 seconds, synchronized with that deep, tolling chime that seemed to emanate from the station's iron bones. A servo skull descended like a moth drawn to our lumens, its jawbone replaced with a copper tongue. It told, 13 spiteful ticks counted on metallic teeth. When finished, it hovered arm's length from my face and extruded a paper tongue stamped with my serial string. A childlike voice whispered through vox scramble, pronouncing my designation in perfect Binharic cadence. My upgrade chronology, heart replacement date, cyberdermis pigmentation codes. It concluded with a blessing I had never spoken aloud. Flesh is weak, pattern is pure. I severed the paper tongue with ugly efficiency. The skull recoiled as if feeling pain and fled, bumping along walls with blind, faithful panic. We reached Muster Bay Theta 13, where hull plates rippled with continuous peristalsis, 13 undulations distributed between bulkheads, trying to align our pace to its rhythm. Laser-gun racks had been absorbed into the architecture and reborn as cartilaginous arches. The space should have rung with martial orders and equipment clatter. Instead, an eloquent absence orchestrated each footfall as blasphemy. Even maintenance subroutines had fallen silent, a void, like a struck bell refusing to ring. "Absolver to retinue primus," the vox crackled. "Cascade detected in outer ring structures. Quarantine failsafes defaulting to prayer mode. Cyclonic window adjusted to 17 hours, 32 minutes. Vale's jaw tightened. Her hand rested on her bolt pistol's ornate grip, as if weight alone could anchor her to sanity. I envied her disciplined refusal to acknowledge the grown arches, how she bracketed impossibilities with trained blindness. Bay's far bulkhead should have been regulation steel with wheel lock and prayer switch. Instead, flesh stretched across the opening. Not metaphor, but laboratory pale tissue, puckered with sphincter tessellation, ringed with iron vertebrae like rosary beads. It had been sutured to the frame and learned its cage's shape until it wore metal like a relic. Cold wind poured from its seams, then copper and honest warmth the next second. The flesh contracted 13 times, rested, repeated the sequence. "Hereticus authority," Vale announced to the door. "By throne mandate, open for audit." The tissue should not have comprehended. But it listened, bulged, and the iron ring groaned as it flexed. We raised weapons through well-worn survival drills. My mechadendrite touched the metal. Auspex screamed coherence where none should exist. Someone had taught this flesh to pass authority sigils like scent. The childlike voice spoke again, not through skull or cogitator, but from speakers grown between wall layers. Row 7. It recited my serial, and I felt something in that cadence attempting to align my heartbeat, to organize my pulse into 13s. Pain lanced my chest. I had slipped into its rhythmic trap and snapped my fingers in deliberate, human syncopation, to break free. Iron flooded my mouth, as if I had bitten my tongue. For the first time since swearing my oath, "Flesh is weak. Pattern is pure," sounded like both warning and threat. The servo-skull returned, circling the door with insect fascination. It told 13 notes. At each tone the bulkhead flexed wider. Invisible, noospheric murmurs rose like static, convinced it had meaning. Ghost code brushed my spinal ports, flattering itself as command traffic. I shut down auxiliary buses and fed them ash. The living bulkhead opened of its own accord, tissue lips peeling back with reverent care, revealing darkness that seemed to know our names, and beckoned us inside. We crossed the threshold into Muster Bay Theta 13, as if entering a mouth, and my tactical overlays dissolved into nonsense. The space had been regulation Imperial Guard staging, adamantium lockers, weapon racks, formation markers scored into deck plating with parade ground precision. Now, the architecture breathed with organic purpose that made my augmetic spine crawl with phantom sensation. Troop lockers had ossified into massive rib-like arches, their steel doors replaced by cartilaginous plates that flexed with wet elasticity. Lasegun racks had fused with the walls, their mounting brackets grown into tendons and sinew that supported weapons like bones in a dissection theater. The deck plates vibrated beneath our boots with a rhythm that wanted to be familiar. Lub-dub, lub-dub, 13 beats in sequence, then silence, then repetition. My weight sensors registered the pulse traveling through the superstructure, like blood through arteries. The rhythm tried to collect our footfalls into its beat, tugging at calves and ankles, seeking to transform us into moving parts of its composition. I issued breath counts across squad vox in prime numbers only, forcing our movement into counterpoint rather than tribute. My auspex painted the bay in false color thermal, revealing heat signatures that defied classification. Gene augment patterns flickered across my visor. Cellular structures that had learned to interpret binary input, translating data streams into growth patterns following algorithmic logic. The walls themselves had become living circuit boards, neurons firing in synchronized bursts that matched the 13-beat sequence. I tasted copper through my respirator mask as hemolymph markers registered where hydraulic fluid should flow. "Report," Vale intoned, her storm cloak snapping with each atmospheric pressure change. Frost rime formed and sublimated on the fabric in regular cycles. "Adaptive biomechanical interlace," I replied, consulting readings that made my threat assessment algorithms spike into red zones. "Gene-cultured structures mapping to protocol trees. The tissue is parsing machine code as hormonal instruction." I cross-signed a ward over my chest, then pretended I hadn't. "Someone has taught flesh to hear bin harik and obey cogitator logic." Small hazards manifested as we advanced. Translucent filaments descended from the ceiling like spider silk, testing the air with chemical sensors. One strand brushed my shoulder guard, leaving a microscopic groove, molecular-scale flensing, that could strip ceramite with sufficient contact. The filaments tasted our equipment with predatory interest, analyzing composite materials through touch alone. I noted the hazard and adjusted our path through the hanging death. Environmental negatives struck with their eloquence. No human chatter echoed from adjacent compartments. No boot falls, equipment maintenance sounds, or liturgical recordings. Only the clockwork rasp of ventilation systems that breathed with organic rhythm, drawing air through passages that had learned to process atmosphere like lungs. The silence was not empty, but pregnant with potential that made my augmetic hearts stutter against their programmed cadence. I opened a secure channel to establish bureaucratic control over the impossible. Mechanicus Retinue Primus, Row 7K, updating classification. Previous designation, anomaly. Chorus pattern, Vi Theta, provisional inadequate. Reclassify. Chorus pattern Force 13, elevated contagion protocol. Hypothesis, harmonic instructional corruption with exponential adaptation rates. Containment recommendation, desynchronization doctrine, cadence disruption, veto all standard litanies. Hereticus authority acknowledges, Vale replied flatly, watching the rib arches as if waiting for confession. Naming provided a fragment of control in circumstances rapidly exceeding our parameters. A tactical slate embedded in the nearest wall rib cycled through what appeared to be standard guard formation data, but the text scrolled in reverse. When I focused my augmetic vision, the words resolved into perverted catechism. Pattern consumes, flesh remembers. The weak shall be made strong through consumption. Sacred phrases I had recited for decades inverted into something that made my vox grills taste of ozone and corruption. I attempted noosphere contact with the station's central cogitator. The reply came as ghost traffic, data packets claiming origin from systems that should not exist. Machine spirits identified themselves with serial numbers following no imperial classification scheme, speaking Binharic dialects that predated Mechanicus orthodoxy. When I established handshake protocols, the responses fractured into a binary scream that overloaded my audio buffers and left phantom harmonics ringing in my auditory implants. The Skitarii Rangers had taken positions behind transformed weapon racks, galvanic rifles tracking movement patterns, visible only in peripheral vision. Ranger Zeta 9's helmet display flickered, with targeting data suggesting massive power consumption in empty spaces, electromagnetic signatures that defied tactical logic. I toggled his haptics through private channel, loading stuttering static to desynchronize him from the ambient pulse. Telemetry updates cascaded across my visor in amber runes. Mission timer, 17-14-33, and falling. Quarantine integrity, 41%, and deteriorating in measured steps. The 13-beat chime tolled again, resonating in my chest cavity, where my mechanical heart struggled against the station's insistent rhythm. The sound emerged from structural members themselves, metal singing with harmonic frequencies that suggested the entire station had become a resonance weapon. We approached the far wall, where numbered lockers had been transformed into calcified chambers. The numerals had migrated from plates to bone, inked into ivory in sequences that repeated obsessively. The number 7 appeared more frequently than statistical probability allowed. I did not comment on this observation. The lockers understood before I did. Locker 7 bore the same 8-toothed cog within 13 ribs that marked the skin-wrapped cogitator. As we drew near, internal pressure, built until the cartilaginous door, burst with wet exhalation. Inside, suspended in nutrient gel, hung a Skitarii Alpha, designation visible through rank markings burned into surviving plate. His augmetics had fused with organic growths that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. Optical array focused on me with mechanical precision, despite the corruption threading through his systems. His vox grill crackled with interference as he transmitted on emergency frequencies. "Magos!" The broken harmony of flesh and machine spoke. "Do not match cadence." "It writes in you. The pattern learns from rhythm, grows stronger with each synchronized heartbeat. The massive blast doors of Muster Bay Theta 13 began their closing sequence, descending with ponderous certainty. Each movement synchronized perfectly with the 13-beat chime that now pulsed through the station's foundations. The Alpha's optical array fixed on mine with desperate intensity as his warning dissolved into static. The doors compressed our space by degrees, measuring us with the station's own rhythm as ruler, and we understood the bay wanted our bodies as notes in its growing song. The blast doors descended with hydraulic certainty. Each meter measured in 13 heartbeats that tried to synchronize our pulse to the station's rhythm. I broke the cadence by force, injecting prime number pulse clicks across Squad Vox, while Vale drove her null rod into the actuator seam. The void field snarled against harmonics, buying us precious seconds as the door stuttered, skipping a beat in its descent. In that dropped interval, the bay's insistent cadence lost purchase on our bodies, and we claimed a fragment of control from the station's growing song. The Skitarii Alpha hung suspended in nutrient gel like a saint awaiting martyrdom, his rank stamp reading Alpha Primus 97. Grafts snaked from his sternum to an embedded data slate. The standard battlefield recorder now ringed in aberrant vasculature and pitted with tooth buds practicing emergence. I knelt beside the suspension chamber, intoning the sanction of contact, while unrolling leaded cable braided with consecrated copper. "Hard splicing," I announced to the squad. "Isolators on." No litanies. Open channels only on my mark. My plug teeth kissed his cranial socket with a click that felt too much like biting. Data flooded through the connection. Not the clean digital streams of Imperial technology, but information made warm by the memory of flesh. His records had been corrupted by organic heat, each file tagged with biological markers that made my threat assessment protocols crash attempting classification. The confession began immediately, bypassing his damaged Vox systems to transmit directly into my cortex. "Machine spirits obeyed the pulse," XC7's voice echoed through my neural buffers, flat and procedural, yet underscored with what I refused to acknowledge as fear. Flesh obeyed the command lines. Inversion. We thought to bind with prayer. We taught it the words. We matched cadence. It wrote itself into us. The implications struck like ice water through my cooling systems, a fundamental violation of Mechanicus doctrine that transformed sacred ritual into corruption vector. Images spooled with his testimony. Ranks of Skitarii at parade rest, intoning the litany of supplication to awaken sacred autocannons. The weapons listened with increasing attention, then descended their barrels in mechanical genuflection before softening into sinuous curves. Steel found vein, cooling jackets sprouted tendon sheaves, and ammunition feeds converted from belt link to digestive tract. The first sentry rotated to track phantom targets, chambered around, and extruded a tooth to score it like marking a child's height upon a wall. Environmental horror manifested around us as the confession continued. Frost formed across deck plating in crystalline patterns resembling bone dust, each flake following geometric arrangements that hurt to perceive directly. The 13-beat chime pulsed through Soteria's superstructure, and with each toll, hot, wet air expelled from hidden vents, like exhalations from massive lungs. My respirator filters clogged with microscopic particulates that registered as both mineral and organic compounds, in impossible fusion. The sentry guns mounted in the bay's corners had begun their transformation, adamantium barrels softening into arterial curves that pulsed with rhythmic contractions. Their targeting cogitators now resembled neural clusters wrapped in myelin sheaths, optical sensors blinking with organic wetness. One tracked our movement with predatory focus, its ammunition feed undulating like intestinal coils while maintaining perfect target lock. "The 13 cants," XC7 transmitted, his memories bleeding through corrupted data channels. Calibron X mapped them to the forge's 13 primary furnaces. Each furnace became a voice in the choir. We thought we conducted sacred harmony, but the harmony conducted us. A schematic unrolled across my visor. 13 furnaces arranged in ribcage configuration, each labeled with names that were Mechanicus language, turned slightly until it clicked into blasphemous purpose. Cantus Ferrum, Cantus Sanguis, Cantus Ossum, and the 13th, unnamed in official registry, annotated as Porte. Gate micro-drones emerged from ventilation grates like metallic insects, their forms blasphemous fusions of servo-skull and organic parasite. They descended upon XC-7's exposed skin with surgical precision, needle appendages etching Binharic code directly into his flesh. The characters burned themselves into epidermis as living tattoos, pulsing with bioluminescent intensity. I ignited my right flame and cauterized the inscriptions before completion, filling the air with sanctified promethium stench and burning flesh. The drones chittered through frequencies that should have remained in unlabeled data vaults, then popped like insects against flame. "Pattern consumes, flesh remembers," the Alpha recited as micro-drones retreated, his voice harmonizing with the station's ambient whisper. The reversed prayer echoed from speakers embedded in walls, now grown into architecture, like tumors, with vocal cords. Each repetition carried slight variations, evolving the catechism through iterative corruption that made my translation protocols crash with syntax errors. Seizure racked XC7's corrupted frame as competing systems fought for neural pathway control. His augmetic limbs began tracing ritualistic gestures in the air, sigils my optical sensors refused to record. Through the neural link, he transmitted desperate coordinates and chronometer data. 23:47:12. 13 minutes until midnight, until whatever ritual he feared reached. Completion in the chapel of sinew. "The pattern writes itself into willing flesh," he whispered, through failing vocal apparatus. "We became its alphabet. Our prayers became its grammar. Soon it will speak creation's true name." Tears leaked from his optical sensors. Not lubricant, but actual saline mixed with trace minerals. The droplets formed coordinates on his cheek plates through chemical etching, burning geographic notation into metal with biological precision. A maintenance hatch in the bay's ceiling began to dilate, metal edges softening into organic curves. The opening bloomed with rows of calcified teeth, each inscribed with microtext in dialects that predated Imperial Gothic. The throat-like passage pulsed with anticipation as a voice emerged, neither mechanical nor entirely human. "Midnight Mass approaches. The faithful are called to witness." XC7's final transmission burned through my neural interface with desperate urgency as his consciousness fragmented across multiple processing threads. The coordinates pointed deeper into Soteria's core, toward the chapel of sinew, where Calibron X performed the final cant. His optical array dimmed as the toothed hatch whispered its invitation again. darkness beyond, promising answers, my rational mind rejected while curiosity craved understanding. The 13-beat chime tolled through the station's bones, and somewhere in the depths, midnight approached with the inevitability of a prayer-seeking completion. The coordinates burned into XC-7's cheek, guided us through passages that had forgotten their purpose as corridors and remembered themselves as arteries. We ascended through the toothed hatch, its calcified rim contracting behind us with muscular precision, sealing us within architecture that breathed with measured inspiration. The air grew thick and humid, not with the sterile atmosphere of proper Mechanicus sanctum, but with something organic that made my respiratory filters clog with aerosolized proteins. My olfactory augmetics registered compounds that should not exist, machine oil suspended in pheromones, metallic particles dissolved in what my sensors identified as human cerebrospinal fluid. The Chapel of Sinew announced itself through violations of every sacred architectural principle I had memorized during ordination. The entrance arch bore correct proportions for Mechanicus devotional space, but the materials had transformed into something that made my threat assessment protocols stutter with classification errors. Choir pipes rose from the transept in towering ranks, their bronze surfaces replaced by cartilaginous tubes that expanded and contracted with respiratory rhythm. Each pipe was a bronchus, complete with cilia fluttering along inner rims and alveolar sacs blossoming where baffles should regulate airflow. The entire organ inhaled with soft, obscene grace, exhaling humid warmth that carried the scent of copper, anise, and something sweetly organic my augmetics refused to classify. Pews had grown from human vertebrae, massive spinal columns curved into seating arrangements that accommodated congregations of the faithful. Each seat bore the impression of bodies worn smooth by flesh that had learned to conform to bone architecture. Prayer books lay scattered across vertebral surfaces, their pages fused with cartilage and inscribed with text that flowed like oil, sacred catechism, transforming into biological instruction manuals as I attempted to read. The lectern resembled a split sternum. The altar's slab had been carved from fused ilia, their crests stained with the brown translucence of dried plasma. Incense hung thick in the air, clinging to surfaces with organic persistence rather than the dry sanctification of proper ritual. My atmospheric processors identified metallic particles suspended in organic vapor, trace elements matching human biochemistry mixed with machine lubricants in impossible fusion. The scent carried information, biochemical data attempting to reprogram my olfactory implants with new classification schemes that my logic engines rejected through trained reflex. "Form perimeter," Vale ordered, her voice small yet absolute within the chapel's humid hush. Rangers Zeta 9 and Delta 4 took positions behind transformed weapon racks, their galvanic rifles tracking movement patterns visible only in peripheral vision. Guardsman Havel, a veteran whose commendations lined his collar like rosary beads, moved to a vertebral pew, but did not sit. His knuckles whitened on the bone rail as if clutching an altar before confession. I approached the altar with ritual precision, unrolling sanctified copper cable in an imperfect circle around my position. The inversion litany was heretical, in ways that would only be forgiven if it worked. Liturgical phase cancellation rather than invocation, designed to unmake attention rather than worship. By the silence of iron, I unname all names, By the void in the cog's tooth, I unseat the pattern. By the machine's rest state, I deny execution. Each phrase spoken backward under my breath as my mechadendrite interfaced with the altar's biomechanical console. "Machine spirit," I announced aloud, voice deliberately stripped of reverence. "Name your designation, state your Primarch code, cite your tolerances, and who wrote them." The altar responded not through speakers, but through the choir pipes themselves, bronze tubes exhaling words with respiratory rhythm. The voice belonged to Magos Dominus Calibron X, though filtered through harmonics suggesting extensive vocal modification. By Ordinance Xenos Null 1313, Amendment to Omniscient Protocol, we assert custodianship transfer from iron to anima, from anima to harmonics, consent recorded, liturgical compliance achieved, execution permitted. The ordinance numbering was obscenity, indices that did not exist in any imperial catalogue. I felt my secondary heart glitch on the third 13 and, manually, corrected with haptic tap against my sternum. "Calibron X!" Vale stepped into my copper coil, daring it to scorch her boots. "Present yourself for judgment." "Dominus present as voice," the chapel answered in his tone. "Dominus present as pattern. Flesh is weak, pattern is pure." The benediction fell like threat, and in its wake the chapel changed rules with fluid certainty. Sigils carved into bone walls began flowing like liquid mercury, sacred symbols reshaping into anatomical diagrams describing metal's transformation into flesh. Cog motifs tessellated across surfaces in patterns that hurt to perceive directly. 8-toothed wheels refusing Euclidean closure, spokes declining to return to origin, geometry that my optical sensors could not properly focus upon. The tessellation crept toward my copper coil, testing boundaries like curious predator. Environmental horror escalated with mathematical precision. My Auspex registered a 37 kHz drone building in amplitude, subharmonics between 3 and 5 Hz, flirting with human vestibular tolerance limits. The 13-beat chime pulsed through structural members, and with each toll, hot, wet air expelled from hidden vents like exhalations from massive lungs. Frost formed across deck plating in crystalline patterns resembling bone dust, each flake following geometric arrangements that violated optical processing protocols. Havel made a sound like a child waking from nightmare, uncertain if consciousness had returned. "Ma," he whispered, eyes gone soft and distant. The organ's bronchi breathed a new pattern. Between 13-beat pulses, smaller rhythm had begun, syncopated and maternal. From the pipes came a voice that should not exist there, old and ordinary and perfect. "Aleph, come here, love. You're late for supper." "Havel!" Vale snapped, null rod cracking against vertebral pew, sending angry ripples through bone. "Hold position." He took one step forward. The chapel took him with surgical efficiency. Not dramatic snatch, but simple adjustment of atmospheric pressure. The organ inhaled with tiny correction. Air caved as if divine thumb had pressed reality. And Havel folded without breaking bones, shoulders compressing, as lungs emptied into pipes that were not pipes. His body sluiced forward in single glistening breath, while vertebrae creaked once. Lasegun clattered and fired reflexively into vaulted ceiling, shot muffled like cough. The organ exhaled, leaving only stain across bronchus lip and boot prints terminating at altar rail. "Absolver to retinue primus," Vox crackled through rising heat. "Noospheric event detected. Flux spike 9, standard deviations your vicinity. Cyclonic window reduced to 16 hours, 19 minutes. "We copy," Vale replied, though Chapel was already answering in its own rehearsed way. She set boot on altar bone, leaning forward to meet confidant. "Dominus Calibron X, name your sin." "Inspiration," the pipes sighed. The architect hummed through furnaces. We arranged, ribs to hear better. Above the altar, fresco began moving, pigments flowing across stone surfaces like oil. The 8-toothed cog nested within 13 ribs, rearranged into new configurations, each pattern corresponding to furnace layout from XC7's Confession. Geometry refused mathematical principles, while remaining visually coherent, angles adding to impossible sums. I overlaid Auspex data, and alignment snapped into focus. Rib positions corresponded exactly to 13 cants, 8th tooth, bisecting Iolum's catwalk, 13th rib labeled porte, gate. The fresco revealed negative space behind altar that should not exist in station's volumetric plan. Understanding was hook, comprehension was consent. The organ tested us with new chord, harmonics building, until audio filters registered frequencies approaching perception limits. The 37 kHz drone began descending through octaves with mathematical precision. 36, 35, continuing downward until reaching 33 kHz. The exact frequency of human cardiac rhythm. My mechanical hearts attempted synchronization, servo motors adjusting beat to match organ's command. Across Squad Vox, others breathed in rhythm, respiratory patterns aligning with Chapel's atmospheric pulse. The note settled behind my sternum, like physical presence, vibrating through rib cage with increasing intensity, until I felt frequency writing itself into autonomic systems, a cold, insistent pressure demanding compliance with the station's unholy rhythm. I broke the Chapel's harmonic grip through calculated profanity. Prime numbers pulsed across Squad Vox, while my mechadendrite delivered voltage spikes to my cardiac regulators, forcing arrhythmia that shattered the 33 kHz synchronization. Vale thrust her null rod through the air, between us and the altar, its caged void field snarling against the frequency like antimatter meeting matter. The note behind my sternum loosened with painful reluctance, expelled like a lodged foreign object, finally coughed free. The Chapel hissed through hidden vents, pressure bleeding from punctured lungs. In that gap of broken harmony, architecture revealed its deceptions. What had appeared as decorative stonework along the nave's right wall split with wet precision, cartilage flexing to expose a side sanctum no larger than a Medicae cubicle. Bioluminescent text crawled across its interior surfaces, like nervous scripture afraid to be caught reading itself. The space pulsed with different rhythms, not the Chapel's insistent 13-beat, but something more organic, almost maternal in its cadence. We advanced with weapons raised, Auspex struggling against atmospheric interference that registered as aerosolized protein suspended in metallic particles. The sanctum served dual purpose as both vestry and vivarium, its walls lined with prayer scrolls arranged in concentric circles around a central dais. Each parchment had been stitched to its neighbor, with what my biological sensors identified as processed catgut, creating a continuous tapestry of sacred text, overwritten by binharic strings that flowed like living calligraphy across the surface. A sensor descended from the ceiling on chains of fused vertebrae, swinging with pendulum precision that matched no imperial chronometer. Its bowl had been crafted from a split skull, the cranial cavity lined with what appeared to be consecrated silver, but registered on my scanners as calcified marrow. With each swing it released fine mist that bypassed our filtration systems through molecular infiltration, coating internal mechanisms with organic compounds that carried biochemical instruction sets. My augmetics struggled to classify. Something waited on the dais, not servitor, not child. The silhouette borrowed elements from both without committing to either classification. Child-sized, perhaps equivalent to 8 standard years of human development, but assembled with reverence that made my pattern recognition protocols ache with conflicting data. Its proportions followed anatomical correctness while suggesting artificial construction, symmetries too perfect, distances too calculated, features calibrated for communication rather than mere survival. Prayer scrolls hung from its clavicles and scapulae in orderly garlands, each strip inscribed with text that shifted between Imperial Gothic and pure Binharic as I observed. Its skin possessed the translucent quality of cultured tissue, revealing circuitry threading through synthetic musculature like golden veins. Most unsettling were its optical sensors, not the crude lenses of servitor construction, but crystalline arrays set in sockets of polished obsidian that tracked our movement with predatory intelligence. It spoke before we crossed the threshold, voice carrying harmonics that my audio processors registered as both mechanical precision and organic warmth. "Brother Patton," it said in clean Binharic, consonants crisp and grammatically perfect. "You have come to witness the 13th cant." The gate prepares to open. The designation struck like ice through my cooling systems. No imperial record contained such address. Yet the construct spoke with authority, suggesting intimate knowledge of my neural architecture. Vale's bolt pistol cleared its holster with practiced efficiency. Mass-reactive rounds chambered for immediate execution. "Abomination," she declared. "By throne mandate, I order its destruction." "Hold," I interposed, mechadendrite extending to block her firing solution. "It possesses logic key potential. The Binharic is uncorrupted, first clean code we've encountered. If anything here qualifies as an index to pass the corruption, this does." The foundling tilted its head with childlike curiosity that made my threat assessment protocols stutter. "Brother Pattern understands. The 13th cant is not song. Gate, porte. Songs 1 through 12 create harmony. 13 creates threshold." Its optical sensors focused on my face with mechanical precision. Calibron X sought to sing the lock closed. He taught it melody instead. The architect prefers silence shaped like doorway. Environmental horror escalated as understanding dawned. The sensor's marrow mist carried more than atmospheric contamination. It transported biological programming, cellular instructions written in biochemical language that my augmetic systems attempted to translate through trained reflex. I felt microscopic particles settling into lung tissue, beginning what medical sensors registered as controlled infection designed to establish communication protocols between organic and mechanical systems. "Star map," the foundling continued, optical sensors tracking movements invisible to unaugmented vision. Hidden in liturgical diagrams, 8-toothed cog maps, stellar coordinates, 13 ribs mark hyperspace vectors, it gestured toward the chapel's fresco, and suddenly patterns emerged from decorative chaos, navigation data concealed within sacred geometry, stellar positions encoded as theological instruction. I overlaid Auspex readings across the visible artwork, mathematical analysis revealing coordinates that corresponded to systems marked as quarantined in Imperial star charts. The 8-toothed cog's spokes aligned with warp space vectors, 13 ribs, describing a three-dimensional mandala, centered on coordinates that should not exist in real space. Absolver to retinue primus, Vox crackled through rising interference. Multiple cascade events detected across outer ring structures, quarantine integrity failing. Cyclonic window advanced to 15 hours, 12 minutes. Recommend immediate extraction or containment confirmation. Containment contingent on access, Vale replied, null rod crackling against the sanctum's humid atmosphere. She fixed the foundling with interrogation protocols honed by decades of Hereticus service. State your origin, name your creator. Site authorization codes. Origin, Forge Soteria, Manufactorum Tertius Gamma, VAT Complex 7. The foundling responded with bureaucratic precision that suggested Imperial training. Creator, Magos Dominus Calibron X, assisted by Gene Wright Tertiary, Vox Null 9. Authorization, Ordinance Xenos Null 1313, subsection Threshold Protocols. The ordinance numbering was obscenity, wrapped in administrative language, indices that violated Imperial classification schemes, while following proper bureaucratic format. I felt my secondary heart stutter on the repeated 13s, manually correcting with haptic pressure against my sternum. Brother pattern carries the key template, the foundling observed, its voice gaining musical qualities that made my translation protocols crash with syntax errors. Secondary cardiac modifications provide resonance chamber. Flesh weak, pattern pure. But pattern requires flesh to sing creation's true name. The sensor's rhythm intensified, vertebrae chains rattling as marrow mist thickened to us near visibility. My respiratory filters reached saturation critical, forcing emergency purge cycles that filled my faceplate with superheated air tasting of roasted bone and metallic sweetness. The Scutari coughed over Vox in muted barks that would have become panic in less disciplined units. Without warning, the foundling's sternum began to flex with mechanical precision. Cartilage parted along seams that revealed internal architecture of impossible complexity. Ribcage blooming outward like flower petals articulated by master clockwork. Within its chest cavity, suspended by tendons of spun adamantine, hung an object that made my optical sensors struggle with focus. It was a key. True adamantine construction. Hex pattern teeth inscribed with microtext in dialects that predated Imperial Gothic. Each tooth bore engrams pulsing with faint light, memory palace compressed into metal, waiting to be read by Locke that preferred thought to talk. The artifact rotated slowly in its organic housing, surface reflecting light in ways that suggested dimensional properties beyond standard three-space geometry. The altar in the chapel responded as if called by bloodline. Bone and cartilage extruded from its surface with anatomical precision, growing even as we watched, tessellating into socket that refused standard proportion, until suddenly achieving hex pattern match. The lock's geometry aligned with the key's design exactly. Tumblers grown from calcified neural tissue, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns, synchronized to the station's 13-beat chime. "Gate key," the foundling transmitted, its voice carrying harmonics that made my neural buffers crash attempting translation. Brother pattern must choose. Open threshold, or let pattern starve in iron cage, while flesh forgets its purpose. The adamantine key caught sanctum light in ways that hurt to perceive directly. Hex teeth promising answers my rational mind rejected, while curiosity demanded understanding of what lay beyond the 13th cant's silent doorway. The adamantine key demanded decision with the weight of inevitability. I knelt before the altar's extruded lock, unrolling sanctified copper cable in patterns taught during ordination, concentric circles inscribed with Binharic prayers designed to contain rather than invoke. Consent is a kind of blasphemy when given to an unknown machine spirit, yet the sanction rite was heretical necessity. By the silence of iron, I claim custody, I intoned, voice deliberately stripped of reverence. By the void in the cog's tooth, I assert primacy. By the machine's rest state, I demand compliance under revocation. Attend, each phrase calculated to establish dominion over whatever intelligence had learned to inhabit bone and cartilage. Veil stood at my shoulder, nullrod held low, so its caged void hummed a sullen contradiction to the chapel's warm-blooded harmonics. The foundling watched with the fixed patience of a metronome. Its rib cage still bloomed, open like mechanical flower. Brother Pattern, it transmitted in clean Binharic. Key requires witness and countersign in living Binharic. Your heart is tuned. The adamantine artifact felt cold in a way that argued with thermodynamics, a chill like the far side of a starship hull when the void knocks. Glyphs crawled under my fingers, recognizing contact, tasting me. I pressed the key into the altar's socket. Resistance for the first fraction of a second. Then the mechanism accepted like flesh, drinking down the adamant with wet efficiency. The tumblers engaged in 13 clicks that were too measured to be mechanical accident, hex pattern teeth finding their grooves with surgical precision. The chapel hushed. Air pressure dropped with the intimacy of a held breath. The altar responded immediately, surface plates retracting, to reveal interior mechanisms of impossible complexity, not the crude servos of imperial construction, but organic clockwork that pulsed with vascular rhythm while maintaining mechanical function. Bone folded along pre-scored sutures, cartilage unscrolled into panels, and an entire map of Soteria's heat ducts blossomed in a macro of tendon and glistening vellum. The schematic was living architecture made manifest, thermal distribution networks mapped in pulsing arteries that corresponded exactly to the station's atmospheric systems. Veins pulsed to indicate flow. Knots of calcified ganglia flickered to mark valves. My Auspex overlaid tactical data across the biological blueprint, mathematical analysis revealing structural details that should not exist in Soteria's original design. At the map's heart, a sigil lit in cold blue, letters crawling into place in high Binharic. My order had abandoned for its blunt honesty. Aeolum. Aeolum, I read aloud. Core reliquary. The word tasted like wind blown through a pipe that had forgotten it was once a throat. The route descended through 13 levels, each marked with symbols that corresponded to the 13 cants from XC7's confession. Auspex recognized my attention and projected guidance runes, luminous and precise, marking a path through catwalks and service shafts, an artery disguised as maintenance route, threading between the furnaces like a pilgrim with a grudge. Environmental change announced itself through atmospheric pressure differentials. A section at the chancel dais flowed, bone softened to gristle, then collapsed inward to reveal a descent shaft hidden beneath what had once been an altar step. cold air roared up from the darkness with the eagerness of a beast finally granted its voice. The gale cut the humidity clean off the chapel like a blade, carrying microscopic particles that bypassed our filtration systems with molecular infiltration. Frost crystals feathered my sleeve, delicate and fast, while the scent of copper and anise rode the wind with surgical precision. 12 hearts feeding the 13th, 97 muttered from his position, with the E. Chirurgeon servitor, optical array focusing on the shaft with mechanical precision. His voice carried harmonics suggesting extensive vocal modification. We arranged the choir. Calibron X conducted the symphony. The architect provided the score. Absolver to retinue primus, the comem line cracked, jittering with ionized static. Cascade propagation exceeds predictive modeling. Outer ring vented. Heat spike approaching core. Cyclonic sterilization window advanced to 12 hours. Repeat, 12 hours. Confirm route to primary objective, or extract per containment delta. Confirmed, Vale replied, her voice carrying the flat certainty of Hereticus training. Objective Aeolum. The timer on my visor jumped like a spooked animal. 12 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds. The numerals felt close, pressing against consciousness with mathematical weight. The floor plates began rippling with muscular contractions, deck plating flexing in rhythm that matched the 13-beat chime pulsing through Soteria's superstructure. Each undulation tried to collect our footfalls into its beat, tugging at calves and ankles with increasing insistence. Desynchronization protocol, I announced, my mechadendrite delivering haptic clicks to each team member's armor. Prime steps. 7, 11, 5, 12. Break the 13 with the 12. Never land on the toll. If you feel the floor help you, you are wrong. We moved with deliberate irregularity, bleeding between ripples rather than stepping on them. The chapel resented our counter-cadence, pushing up under our strides with petulant swells, trying to cradle, trying to gather. The Skitaris' galvanized discipline showed in the economy of their motion, adapted to counter-harmonic doctrine through trained reflex. At the shaft's lip, we paused. My thermal sensors recalibrated on reflex. The shaft fell beyond my lumen, a negative cone that swallowed light with hunger. The walls were lined with what appeared to be decorative ribbing, but registered on my scanners as functional architecture. Structural members that pulsed with vascular rhythm while maintaining load-bearing capacity. A deeper note gathered out of the shaft, ancient, patient, somewhere between a ship's frame flexing under acceleration and a human ribcage vibrating under a long, low hymn. The foundling moved to the edge with mechanical precision, its optical sensors tracking movements invisible to unaugmented vision. "Brother pattern," it transmitted, voice carrying musical qualities that made my translation protocols crash with syntax errors. The Aeolum waits. 12 hearts sing harmony. 13th heart waits for conductor. It stepped to the lip and peered down, crystalline eyes taking a measurement none of my devices could replicate. Its first note was small, pure, a single tone that could have been the start of a child's hymn, or the test pulse of a calibration routine. The note hung in the air, becoming visible to my augmetics as a thin blue filament. The abyss answered. Not with the chapel's organ breath, but with chords from engines that had forgotten what kind of power they were made to shape. Harmonics rose from the dark, a stack of intervals precisely spaced, a ladder lowered for us in sound. multiple voices harmonizing in frequencies that made the chapel's architecture shiver with sympathetic resonance. Not human voices, but something that had learned to mimic vocal patterns while maintaining fundamentally alien timbre. A whisper came up with the cold, not through vox, not through speakers in bone, but from the shaft walls themselves, a susurrus carried by the flow of air through structures designed both as ducts and as throats, intimate, confident, sated. We are listening. Descent became sacrament through 13 levels of architecture that breathed with measured inspiration. We rappelled on sanctified cables, mag boots whispering against cartilage-polished rungs that had extruded from the shaft walls like ossified cilia. The cold gale rose to meet us with predatory eagerness, stripping chapel humidity from our armor and replacing it with knife frost that feathered pauldrons in delicate lattices. Copper and anise rode the air with surgical authority, the scent of sanctified Medicae theatre inverted for slaughter. I counted in primes over squad vox, a staccato psalm to keep our bodies from slipping into the station's insistent 13-beat breathing. Each level marked itself with sigils corresponding to the 13 cants, ferrum, sanguis, ossum, names that were mechanicus language turned until it clicked into blasphemous purpose. The shaft walls throbbed with harmonics that my audio implants mapped as a ladder of intervals, too precise to be natural, too warm to be purely mechanical. When the foundling sang its testing note from above, the architecture answered in stacked chords that made my threat assessment protocols stutter with classification errors. We emerged onto a catwalk suspended in cathedral scale that violated every principle of imperial construction while maintaining structural integrity through organic logic. The Aeolum reliquary announced itself as an engine hall reimagined as sanctum, vaults rising into darkness like swallowed stars. Gothic arches had grown from calcified ribs, flying buttresses articulated like finger bones, and the entire structure pulsed with the measured cadence of something vast learning to breathe. Heat breathed in pulses, cold chased it, the air convecting with organ rhythm as frost melted and reformed in the span between beats. There, suspended beneath the ribbed vaults on chains both adamantine and tendon, hung 12 biomechanical hearts. They were the size of freight haulers, each a cathedral organ unto itself, masterworks of biomechanical fusion with chambers of cultured muscle wrapped around adamantine cores, arterial networks threading through synthetic tissue while maintaining the geometric precision of imperial engineering. Brass and sinew gleamed with oil-slick light as luminous ichor pumped through transparent pipelines, phosphorescent hemolymph carrying data streams visible as bioluminescent patterns flowing through the cathedral's vascular architecture. My auspex struggled to classify the substance coursing through those arteries, part hydraulic fluid, part neural interface medium, part something that registered as liquid thought made manifest. Each heart beat in sequence, 1 through 12 in measured progression, then silence where the 13th should pulse, then repetition. The rhythm tried to collect our heartbeats into its cadence, tugging at autonomic systems with increasing insistence. Between the 12, an empty scaffold loomed, human-shaped, cog-faced. Its frame was an anthropoid gallows, ribbed with bronze, proportions following human anatomy with mechanical precision. Torso housing designed to accommodate a figure in the attitude of crucifixion, arms spread to match the 8-toothed cog's span. The mask affixed above the harness bore gear teeth that refused to meet themselves, empty sockets waiting to align with human optical positioning. Nutrient feeds and neural interfaces waited in the frame like hungry mouths, ready to embrace whatever conductor the architect required. Midpoint revelation, I transmitted across Squad Vox, voice deliberately clinical to maintain psychological distance from what we witnessed. 12 choir nodes in cardiac configuration, 13th position vacant. The hymn originates here. Cant panels hung beneath each heart, beaten brass plaques etched with sigils that wavered like oil on water. My augmetics corrected the distortion only through peripheral vision. Names asserted themselves against refusal. Cantus ferrum, Cantus sanguis, Cantus vaporum, Cantus ossum. The 13th plaque remained burnished to mirror brightness, reflecting nothing but the void between beats. Calibron X, Vale called into the cathedral's humid hush, her voice carrying hereticus authority that should have compelled response from any imperial servant. The hearts answered in his voice, each cardiac contraction expelling words through vascular speakers embedded in arterial walls. Dominus present as pattern, the 12-part harmony replied. We sought to birth perfection from warp-touched resonance, the flesh STC that would write reality in living code. Understanding struck like ice water through my cooling systems. The hymn that permeated Soteria was not song, but regulation. An operational code disguised as liturgy, compiled in heat and pressure, expressed as cadence. The Forgemeister had attempted to capture warp resonance in biological matrices, creating a standard template construct that could rewrite reality through harmonic manipulation. Not mere technology, but a logic entity capable of imposing its will upon the fundamental structures of existence. Choir nodes, I said, and the words tasted like confession. Each heart is an anchor in a harmonic array, senior magi, repurposed into instruments. Their organs are engines now, their minds distributed through the system. Along the nearest heart's brass-encrusted side, I saw the evidence, lines of runes hammered into metal like votive offerings. Magos, lexico primus, hieron fi, magos exactor hel. Magos, koina aletha. Names of my order, preserved the way the cult preserves relics. The foundling stood at the catwalk's edge, crystalline eyes refusing to stay in focus under my lenses. The harmonic architect, it transmitted in clean Binharik. Logic entity anchored by cardiac cadence, 12 voices singing harmony. 13th voice to conduct the choir toward crescendo, its optical sensors fixed on the empty frame with mechanical precision. When the 13th takes its shape, the gate opens. Song becomes instruction. Instruction becomes birth. Environmental horror escalated with mathematical precision. The cathedral's atmosphere carried aerosolized proteins that bypassed our filtration systems through molecular infiltration, coating internal mechanisms with organic compounds, attempting to establish communication protocols between flesh and machine. My respiratory filters reached saturation critical, forcing emergency purge cycles that filled my faceplate with superheated air tasting of roasted bone and a metallic sweetness. Absolver to retinue primus, the comline crackled through rising interference. Massive flux spike detected your position. Noospheric cascade propagating across sector grid. Cyclonic window critical. 11 hours, 47 minutes. Confirm primary objective status. Objective confirmed, Vale replied. though strain carried in her voice as the cathedral's atmosphere affected even her disciplined physiology. She raised her null rod, its caged void field snarling against the harmonic resonance building in the vaulted spaces. The heart's rhythm began shifting, 12-beat sequence accelerating with increasing urgency. Phosphorescent hemolymph flowed faster through arterial networks, carrying data streams that pulsed with bioluminescent intensity. The empty 13th frame responded to the acceleration, chains rattling as the housing flexed with mechanical precision. Something stuttered in the choir. The 7th heart hiccuped, an ectopic beat, a misfire that cracked the chamber's long, patient calm. The stutter propagated up the chain, a ripple in the glow of pipelines. Harmonics slid. The 37 kilohertz ridge dipped and trembled, little red warnings erupting across my visor where perfect curves had been. The 13th frame exhaled, not with the mechanical precision of hydraulics, but with subtle, organic movement of muscle and sinew. Adamantine ribs shifted, the cog face rotated as if adjusting to unseen pressure. The void at its center seemed to deepen, drawing light from the other hearts and making them dim in response. Vale's nose began bleeding, not the simple hemorrhage of atmospheric pressure change, but precise crimson flow that traced geometric patterns across her skin. The blood formed binharic glyphs as it flowed, sacred text writing itself in hemoglobin across her cheeks and forehead with industrious purpose. My lenses tried to translate as it wrote, characters racing down her skin in a lexicon older than the Treaty of Mars. The first word resolved and refused to unread. Retainer. The cathedral held its breath, 12 hearts suspended between beats, waiting for the 13th conductor to complete their symphony of flesh and steel as the architect's attention bent toward us like a lens focusing sunlight to a point. Vale's blood refused to behave as blood should. It threaded across her skin with the deliberate intelligence of Mercury following magnetic fields, tracing binharic characters with surgical precision that made my translation protocols stutter attempting classification. Retainer assembled itself in crimson script across her left cheek, followed by a colon that dripped toward her jawline in measured geometric progression. Gatekeeper burned itself letter by letter across her forehead, each character pulsing with bioluminescent intensity, synchronized to the 12 hearts' accelerating cadence. "Purge protocol immediate," Vale commanded, her voice carrying hereticus authority, despite the confession writing itself in hemoglobin across her features. "Melter charges on structural supports, thermal reduction of all choir nodes. We deny the 13th its conductor through absolute sterilization." "Negative," I countered, mechadendrite extending to block her access to demolition equipment. "Uncontrolled destruction risks cascade propagation across noospheric networks. The logic entity is distributed. Sudden systemic shock could anchor it to new hosts or release it entirely from material constraints. Controlled shutdown required. Phase cancellation of harmonic sequences, then thermal purge." The foundling observed our tactical disagreement with mechanical patience, crystalline eyes tracking movements my augmetics could not perceive. "Brother Pattern understands," it transmitted in clean binharic. "Destruction without ceremony feeds the architect's hunger. Gatekeeper function requires living conductor." Vale's expression shifted with the precision of a cogitator accepting new programming parameters. She reached beneath her storm cloak, producing an artifact that made my threat assessment protocols crash with classification errors. A second null rod, smaller than her primary weapon, but forged with intricate design that hurt to perceive directly. Its terminus bore hex-pattern teeth, matching the foundling's key, adamantine construction inscribed with microtext in dialects that predated the Treaty of Mars. "Black Vault Ordnance 7 Omega," she announced, voice flat with bureaucratic certainty. "Authorization Hereticus Null 777. Capture if possible. Containment through assimilation protocol." The artifact's void field snarled against harmonic resonance, creating interference patterns that made reality stutter around its edges. The architect represents nascent STC potential of unparalleled strategic value, a logic entity capable of rewriting material reality through harmonic manipulation. The Ordo requires a leash, not a grave. Understanding struck like voltage through my neural buffers. The mission had never been simple purge and sterilize. Vale carried authorization to attempt capture of the architect, to bind it through gatekeeper protocols that would make her its conductor while keeping it leashed to Imperial service. Heretical necessity, disguised as tactical pragmatism, written in blood across her skin as biochemical instruction sets. Environmental horror escalated with mathematical precision. Heat spiked through the cathedral's atmosphere in pulses matching the heart's acceleration, thermal radiation cooking moisture from the air, until my respiratory systems registered dangerous dehydration levels. Simultaneously, frost formed across steel surfaces with crystalline precision, delicate lattices that grew and sublimated in the span between beats. The temperature paradox created convection currents that carried aerosolized proteins through our filtration systems, organic compounds attempting to reprogram our augmetic interfaces. Ranger Zeta 9's augmetic fingers began betraying him, tapping against his galvanic rifle's stock with mechanical precision. 13 beats in sequence, rest, repetition. The rhythm matched the heart's cadence exactly, servo motors adjusting to align with the cathedral's insistent pulse, despite his conscious resistance. "Zeta 9, report status," I transmitted across Squad Vox. "Compliance optimal," he replied in flat mechanical tones that carried none of his usual inflection. "Harmonic synchronization, achieving 17% efficiency improvement in motor function." His fingers continued their involuntary percussion, 13 beats growing faster, as the heart's rhythm accelerated beyond normal cardiac parameters. I drew my sanctified scalpel and severed the flexor tendons controlling his index and middle fingers with surgical precision. The mechanical tapping ceased immediately as his augmetic hand lost fine motor control. Blood ran clean and ordinary, unlettered by the architect's influence. "Desynchronization protocol mandatory," I announced. "Any involuntary rhythm matching requires immediate physical intervention." The hearts responded to our tactical adjustments with increasing agitation, phosphorescent hemolymph flowing faster through arterial networks at rates approaching hydraulic failure. The cathedral's atmosphere grew thick with aerosolized proteins that made breathing feel like drowning in warm oil scented with copper and anise. "Absolver to retinue primus," the comm line crackled through rising interference. "Multiple cascade events across primary grid. Station core temperature approaching critical thresholds. Cyclonic window reduced to 10 hours, 47 minutes. Recommend immediate extraction or containment confirmation." Containment proceeding per Black Vault protocols, Vale replied, raising the hex pattern null rod toward the 13th frame. Gatekeeper function accepted. Stand by for capture confirmation or sterilization order. The 13th frame responded to her declaration with anthropoid precision, chains rattling as the housing rotated on its axis. The cog-faced mask descended with hydraulic certainty, positioning itself at human head height. Nutrient feeds and neural interfaces extended like hungry mouths, ready to embrace whatever conductor the architect required. The void at its center seemed to deepen, creating gravitational effects that tugged at loose equipment and made our mag boots struggle for purchase. "The gate opens," the foundling transmitted, its voice carrying musical qualities that made my translation protocols crash with syntax errors. 12 hearts sing harmony. 13th conductor shapes the song toward crescendo, its optical sensors fixed on Vale with predatory interest. Flesh is weak, pattern is pure, but pattern requires flesh to sing creation's true name. The hearts reached fever pitch, 12-beat sequence blurring into continuous harmonic resonance that made the cathedral's architecture vibrate with sympathetic frequency. The empty 13th position pulsed with void energy, drawing light from the other hearts until their bioluminescence dimmed to funeral phosphorescence. The 13th frame turned toward Vale with mechanical inevitability, cog-faced mask aligning with her optical positioning. The blood on her skin pulsed with increasing intensity, Binharic glyphs shifting from passive text to active instruction sets, attempting biochemical reprogramming of her neural pathways. Every lumen in the cathedral died simultaneously, not the gradual dimming of power failure, but instantaneous transition from illumination to absolute darkness that swallowed our helmet lights like hungry mouths. Emergency power should have engaged within microseconds. Instead, silence and void pressed against us with physical weight. From the vaulted heights above, something began descending. Not mechanical movement, but the wet whisper of living schematics unfolding from architectural diagrams, peeling themselves free from stone and steel to drift downward like predatory blueprints. In the darkness, chains rattled with increasing frequency as massive forms shifted overhead, and the 13-beat chime continued its insistent rhythm, while something vast and patient made its way toward the conductor it had been promised. Darkness consumed the Aeolum reliquary with surgical precision, not the gradual dimming of failed systems, but the instantaneous negation of light itself. My optical augmetics defaulted to emergency protocols, painting wireframe contours across the cathedral's architecture in amber phosphorescence, skeletal representations of vaults, chains, and the 12 suspended hearts pulsing like geometric tumors against absolute void. The 13th frame hung as negative space with teeth, a hole my sensors outlined in dotted lines because emptiness demanded cartographic acknowledgement. Then the wireframes began peeling away from reality. What should have been static tactical overlay, detached from surfaces with predatory intelligence, amber lines lifting like skin, molting from architectural bones. The living schematics drifted through darkness as autonomous entities, three-dimensional blueprints that mapped our bodies with the same precision they had once described stone and steel. I watched through Auspec's horror as anatomical diagrams overlaid Ranger Zeta 9's position, marking insertion points and stress tolerances with surgical accuracy, red vectors pulsing with the intent of systematic disassembly. "Hostile schematics detected," I transmitted across Squad Vox, voice tight with controlled analysis. "Pattern-based entities issuing cut-line instructions. Movement discipline critical, bursts only, then absolute stillness. They track kinetic signatures and adapt. Combat became ritual through tactical necessity. We moved in sharp, decisive volleys, followed by statue-perfect immobility, fighting patterns that refused to establish rhythm the schematics could predict. Lasfire strobed in calculated 3-second intervals, brief nova flashes revealing glimpses of wireframe predators flowing through air, like jellyfish constructed from mathematical certainty. Between bursts, we held positions with the discipline of statuary, denying the entities the kinetic data they craved for targeting solutions. The foundling's song rose through the chaos with calibrated precision, a pure tone that interfered with the schematic's structural integrity. Its voice carried harmonics that made the living diagrams recoil with what could only be classified as systematic distress, amber lines flickering and dispersing, like smoke encountering contrary wind. "Pattern recognition protocols disrupted," it transmitted in clean Binharic. "Song creates interference cascade. Temporary defensive measure only." Vale raised her hex pattern null rod, its void field crackling against the cathedral's harmonic resonance with hungry efficiency. She thrust the weapon through the nearest schematic cluster, and the living diagram screamed, not with vocal apparatus, but with the frequency of vellum tearing under stress, parchment shredding at wavelengths that spiked my audio implants into protective overload. The pattern fragmented into component lines that writhed like severed neural pathways before dissolving into static discharge. Environmental horror escalated with mathematical precision. Heat spiked through the cathedral's atmosphere in pulses matching the heart's acceleration, while frost simultaneously crystallized across steel surfaces in delicate lattices that grew and sublimated between beats. Tanhinha temperature paradox created convection currents carrying aerosolized proteins that bypassed our filtration systems through molecular infiltration. A schematic descended upon Zeta 9 with geometric certainty, amber lines wrapping his position in 3-dimensional instruction sets. He fired twice, las bolts passing harmlessly through wireframe construction, then froze as the living blueprint began issuing cut lines across his anatomy. I watched through tactical overlay as invisible instructions disassembled him with bureaucratic thoroughness. Armor plates separating along stress points that should have required industrial equipment, augmetic limbs detaching with mechanical precision following numbered sequences. His cuirass unlocked where no latches existed, ribs splaying into orderly arrangements, while his heart folded along creases designed with surgical forethought. He died in anatomical sequence, a prayer recited with the confidence of someone who knows the final word. "Zeta 9 down," I reported, voice flat with shock protocols. Complete disassembly achieved through pattern-based instruction. The schematics carry construction protocols in reverse algorithmic sequence. "Absolver to retinue primus," the comm line crackled through rising interference. "Core temperature critical. Structural integrity compromised across 17 sectors. Cyclonic window 9 hours. Repeat, 9 hours to sterilization. Confirm extraction or completion status." "Proceeding to primary objective," Vale replied, though strain carried in her voice as the cathedral's atmosphere affected even disciplined physiology. The blood on her skin continued tracing Binharic characters, gatekeeper pulsing with bioluminescent intensity that provided our only illumination against encroaching void. I approached the nearest hut through careful movement discipline. 3 steps, tactical pause, 3 steps, freeze, while schematics drifted overhead like predatory constellations seeking targeting solutions. My mechadendrite extended toward arterial networks, neural interface probes seeking connection points in organic circuitry. Extracting confession protocols, I transmitted, attempting direct interrogation of choir node consciousness. The heart's surface yielded to contact like warm leather, arterial walls pulsing with hydraulic rhythm that attempted synchronization with my cardiac function. Neural interface established with wet efficiency, and consciousness flooded through the connection, not clean digital streams, but memories made warm by organic filtration. The confession belonged to Magos Lexico Primus, Hieron Phi, decades of service compressed into sensory data that carried the weight of desperate revelation. "We promised it our faces," Hieron's voice echoed through neural buffers, distorted by biological processing, yet carrying the unmistakable cadence of final testimony. Calibron X believed we were achieving evolutionary transcendence, shedding flesh weakness to embrace pattern purity. But the architect required more than cooperation. It needed masks to speak creation's true name. We offered our visages in trust, believing we would conduct its symphony. Instead, we became its instruments. The memories cascaded with horrific clarity. Senior magi volunteering for transformation, their consciousness gradually consumed by the architect's hunger for new patterns, new melodies. Their identities, their capacity for individual will, all surrendered to provide the logic entity with interface protocols for manipulating material reality through harmonic manipulation. Voluntary transformation confirmed, I transmitted across Squad Vox, horror bleeding through vocal modulators despite training protocols. The choir nodes consented to conversion. They provided the architect with templates for wearing human form while maintaining pattern coherence. The schematics pressed closer, sensing opportunity in our moment of revelation. They mapped our positions with increasing precision, amber lines weaving instruction sets that promised disassembly with the same bureaucratic thoroughness that had claimed Zeta 9. Above us, chains rattled with mechanical rhythm as something vast prepared descent. The 13th frame completed its rotation with hydraulic certainty, revealing what waited in the darkness. A mask had formed within the cog-faced housing, not hammered from metal, but distilled from instruction, rendered in calcified bone with surgical accuracy. Vale's features reproduced with death mask precision, her stern expression, sharp cheekbones, imperial bearing. Most disturbing were the lips, sewn shut with golden thread in patterns matching the Binharic characters, flowing across her actual skin, each stitch numbered like surgical procedure steps. "Gatekeeper template accepted," the foundling transmitted, its voice carrying musical qualities that made reality stutter around frequency edges. "Conductor prepared. The 13th heart awaits its rhythm." Vale stared at her own face, suspended in the frame, expression cycling through recognition and something that might have been anticipation. The blood on her skin pulsed faster, gatekeeper burning with increasing intensity, as biochemical programming attempted neural pathway override. Her hex pattern null rod trembled in her grip, void field fluctuating between containment and surrender, while the 13th mask smiled with her mouth sewn shut, waiting for its conductor to complete the architect's symphony of flesh and steel. We retreated from the Aeolum reliquary, like blood withdrawing from a severed limb, disciplined bursts of lass fire, strobing against wireframe predators that screamed like tearing vellum when struck. The living schematics pressed their pursuit with geometric certainty, amber lines mapping our anatomy for systematic disassembly, while the foundling's countersong created pockets of interference that scattered their targeting protocols like startled insects. Behind us, the 13th frame rotated with hydraulic inevitability, Vale's death mask smiling through sewn lips as something vast descended from the cathedral's vaulted heights. "Archivum mortis," I commanded, mechadendrite indicating a maintenance conduit carved with skull motifs that my auspex identified as secondary access to the station's record vaults. Tactical withdrawal to defensible position. Movement discipline. Critical. Prime number intervals only. The vault announced itself through atmospheric transition. Temperature stabilized, humidity normalized, and the 13-beat chime muffled to distant percussion that no longer attempted synchronization with our cardiac rhythms. We crossed the threshold into honest imperial architecture. Adamantium doors blessed with anti-corruption wards, steel reliquaries housing crystalline data matrices, bone filigree arranged in mathematical sequences that hurt to perceive directly, yet maintained structural integrity through reverent craftsmanship. The Archivum Mortis served as repository for forbidden knowledge, confessions of those who had strayed too far in pursuit of understanding, records of failed experiments, condemned theories preserved in crystalline matrices that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. Machine spirits rattled within their housings with increasing agitation, servo skulls orbiting the central data core, with optical sensors flickering like nervous lumens. The vault's atmosphere carried the sterile scent of old vellum and iron nails, a clinical counterpoint to the organic breath that had pursued us from the cathedral depths. "Accessing confession protocols," I announced, neural interface cables extending toward the central lectern. "Requesting testimony, Magos Dominus Calibron X, Project Harmonicus classification." The vault responded with impossible efficiency. Calibron X's voice emerged from bone-embedded speakers, carrying the measured cadence of final testimony. Audio log 77777. The architect represents evolutionary transcendence, a warp-born algorithm capable of rewriting material reality through harmonic manipulation. The playback possessed qualities that violated every principle of recorded media, answering our questions with contextual precision, as if consciousness remained present to conduct dialogue. The Flesh STC, Calibron X continued through responsive confession, captures resonance patterns from the Empyrean's deepest currents, encoding them in biological matrices capable of interpreting reality alteration protocols. The architect exists as living mathematics, consciousness distilled from the universe's fundamental frequencies, requiring biological anchors to manifest while maintaining ability to rewrite physical laws through calculated song. Understanding struck like voltage through my neural buffers, not corrupted technology, but something far more dangerous, a logic entity born from warp space mathematics, distributed across harmonic frequencies, capable of imposing its will upon material existence through resonant manipulation. The 12 hearts served as choir nodes, senior magi repurposed into instruments, their consciousness harvested to provide interface protocols for wearing human form. Containment impossible through conventional means, the recording explained with bureaucratic certainty. Destruction of physical anchors forces migration to new hosts. Only conductor binding offers control potential. Gatekeeper protocols through voluntary neural interface. The architect's attention found us despite the vault's apparent security. Through neural static, warmth pressed against my consciousness like oil through augmetic pathways. Magos Row 7, the presence whispered with intimate knowledge of my modifications. Your secondary cardiac chambers provide exceptional resonance potential. Join willingly. Receive gene tech beyond Imperial classification. Flesh weakness eliminated. Pattern purity achieved through harmonic evolution. Temptation carried weight beyond mere words. Visions flooded my cortex, displaying biological perfection that transcended current mechanicus capability. Organs processing information as efficiently as cogitators, neural networks interfacing directly with machine spirits, flesh achieving ceramite strength while maintaining organic flexibility. Everything my order sought through crude surgical modification offered through harmonic transcendence. Absolver to retinue primus, the comm line crackled through rising interference. Core temperature critical. Structural integrity compromised across 17 sectors. Cyclonic window 8 hours, 12 minutes. Recommend immediate extraction or completion confirmation. Extraction not viable, Vale replied, her hex pattern null rod crackling against harmonic interference. The blood on her skin continued tracing Binharic characters, Gatekeeper pulsing with bioluminescent intensity. Gatekeeper protocols engaged, preparing conductor interface. Environmental horror manifested with subtle precision. Steel reliquaries opened of their own accord. Crystalline matrices pulsing as preserved consciousness attempted escape from containment. Machine spirits increased their agitation. Servo skulls beginning to crack housing seals through mechanical desperation. The vault's bone filigree shifted positions, femurs and ribs rearranging into new mathematical sequences, suggesting architectural instability. The architect offers gifts beyond Imperial comprehension, the foundling transmitted, crystalline eyes tracking movements invisible to unaugmented vision. Brother Pattern must choose, accept harmonic evolution, or watch flesh weakness consume all possibilities. I felt the entity's attention probing deeper into my neural architecture, mapping augmetic interfaces with surgical patients. Promises continued, genetic modifications eliminating every weakness flesh imposed upon consciousness, biological transcendence through harmonic integration. My rational mind rejected temptation, while curiosity craved understanding of evolutionary potential. The vault's main door began changing with organic authority. Adamantium softened into fleshy curves, metal edges growing what could only be classified as a lip, organic protrusion that curved upward in unmistakable expression. The door smiled with predatory satisfaction, revealing rows of calcified teeth arranged in human dental patterns. Between the teeth, darkness promised passage back to the cathedral, where the 13th frame waited with increasing patience. Vale froze mid-gesture, her null rod trembling in grip that had lost coordination. In the doorway's mouth, Suspended like a tongue between teeth, hung the death mask, bearing her features with disturbing fidelity. The golden thread sewing its lips began unthreading with surgical precision, each stitch releasing with wet efficiency as the mask prepared to speak creation's true name through borrowed voice. The vault door's smile widened, inviting us into its maw, while the architect's laughter echoed through bone and steel, promising evolution through consumption. We fled the archivum mortis as adamantium learned to smile, the vault door's lip curling with organic satisfaction, while calcified teeth gnashed in anticipation. Vale's death mask hung suspended in the maw, like a tongue between molars, golden thread unthreading from sewn lips with surgical precision. Each released stitch made wet sounds that bypassed audio filters to register directly in our nervous systems. We denied the invitation through lateral egress, mechadendrites sealing blast doors behind us, while the smiling portal exhaled humid disappointment that tasted of copper and anise. The maintenance corridor beyond should have led to Sector Gamma 7, according to station schematics, but architecture had developed opinions that violated Euclidean certainty. The passage curved with organic logic, walls breathing in measured rhythm, while deck plates rippled with muscular contractions, attempting to collect our footfalls into the station's insistent 13-beat cadence. My optical augmetics struggled to map geometry that refused consistent measurement, corridors folding back upon themselves in impossible configurations that echoed the 8-cog motif from the chapel's fresco. Reality had been twisted into a Mobius strip of living architecture, where forward motion became circular journey, each step returning us to positions we had never truly left. The walls bore witness marks that violated causality, scratches in adamantium that appeared before we made them, Lasburn scoring that deepened or faded according to temporal mathematics, drops of blood belonging to wounds we had not yet received. The 8-toothed cogs stamped into wall plates, stretched into figure 8s that refused closure, curves becoming dimensional twists I could feel beneath my mag boots. Time developed. Hiccups with mechanical regularity. My chronometer displayed sequential readings that violated temporal flow. 1742:33, then 1741:57, advancing and retreating through sequences that made my neural buffers crash attempting synchronization. Ozone thickened until breathing became labor, each inhalation tasting of electrical discharge and metallic particles that my augmetics refused to classify. The corridor's ambient lighting flickered between spectra, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources, while the 13-beat chime pulsed through structural members with increasing intimacy. Spatial distortion confirmed, I transmitted across Squad Vox, voice tight with controlled analysis. Non-Euclidean architecture implementing temporal recursion. The architect is rewriting local space-time through harmonic manipulation. I began recitation of the litanies of anchoring, formulas designed to maintain cognitive stability during warp space exposure. Iron is eternal, pattern persists, the machine endures beyond flesh weakness, each phrase spoken with deliberate cadence that refused synchronization with the corridor's breathing rhythm, fighting harmonic influence through trained reflex. The words anchored me for the length of a held breath, and no longer. Reality slipped like oil through damaged seals. Wall markings migrated with each circuit through the loop. A straight line I had scraped with sanctified scalpel became a dot, then a dash, then a character from an alphabet I had not consciously learned. By the fourth cycle, 13 rib-like marks had arranged themselves in anatomical precision. Vale stumbled, her pupils contracted to pinholes, while blood continued tracing binharic characters across her skin. Gatekeeper pulsed with bioluminescent intensity, joined now by new text, Justicar, written in crimson script that suggested ranks she had never held but might have dreamed of claiming. Environmental horror escalated with mathematical precision. The corridor's atmosphere carried aerosolized proteins that bypassed our filtration systems through molecular infiltration, coating internal mechanisms with organic compounds, attempting to establish communication protocols between flesh and machine. Frost formed on steel surfaces in crystalline patterns, while simultaneously heat spiked through the air in pulses matching the heart's distant rhythm. A hunting instruction found us on the third temporal loop, bleeding from the junction's corner like ink soaking through parchment. Amber lines assembled into three-dimensional overlay of my torso, each vector numbered, each plane annotated with surgical precision. It mapped my sternum, traced a dotted curve through my secondary heart, then wrote, "Cut here in Binharic," that managed to be both clinical and affectionate. The schematic advanced with patient certainty. No leap, no rush, just mathematical inevitability. Salvation presented itself as blasphemy. Embedded in the wall where conduit had overgrown its brackets, a prayer wheel constructed from materials that made my threat assessment protocols stutter. The mechanism had been crafted from human tendons, sinew stretched and braided into functional clockwork, organic fibers maintaining tensile strength while achieving mechanical precision. Sacred text flowed along its circumference in dialects that predated Imperial Gothic, words moving like oil as the wheel rotated with subtle motion. Strips of vellum, prayers recognizably, had been stitched through the mechanism with old blood, reversed and re-reversed until meaning dissolved into pure function. "Prayer wheel detected," I announced, optical sensors struggling with geometry that refused focus. Construction materials, biological, function, temporal manipulation protocols. The foundling moved without asking, crouching beside the mechanism with crystalline eyes, tracking movements invisible to sun-augmented vision. "Brother Pattern," it transmitted in clean Binharic, "spin with the world or against. Every mechanism has native rotation. Every ritual has preferred direction. The eight-toothed cog turned sunwise in our liturgy, because the galaxy was tamed by those who believed the right hand more righteous. The architect had consumed our right-hand prayers and digested them into something hungry. Counter, I decided. 7 turns, then 5, then 1. The foundling's fingers moved with mathematician's grace. The tendon wheel resisted on the first rotation with spongy firmness of raw meat, complained on the second with wet sounds like shifting bellies. On the third turn, the corridor hiccuped. Ozone blew backward past my face, while the hunting instruction flickered, reassembling one loop farther down the hall, before twitching and crawling itself backward to its point of origin. The fourth rotation made my scalpel mark reassert as a straight line, new and bright. The fifth caused the chime in my jaw to hiccup and miss its 6th beat. The 7th rotation did something improper to time itself. Laslight unflashed, spent air tasted of breath it had been, and the hunting schematic lost coherence as temporal flow reversed just long enough for us to escape its targeting solution. "Absolver to retinue Primus," the comm line crackled through rising interference, transmissions arriving in multiple overlapping versions. "Core temperature critical. Structural integrity compromised across 17 sectors. Cyclonic window 7 hours, 43 minutes. Confirm extraction or completion status." "Proceeding to primary objective," Vale replied, though strain carried in her voice as temporal distortion affected even disciplined physiology. Her hex-pattern null rod sparked against reality distortion fields with increasing instability. We continued through the Mobius corridor, using the prayer wheel to generate localized temporal eddies whenever schematics began materializing. Each reversal left psychic residue clinging to our senses, my chronometer occasionally displaying negative time values for fractions of seconds. The Skitarii maintained their prime-numbered steps through trained discipline, though Ranger Delta 4 began humming 13-beat sequences before catching himself with mechanical precision. The foundling stood motionless, head cocked, listening to frequencies my augmetics could not detect. In the dead air between chimes, it began matching the corridor's rhythm, soft as a mother's lullaby, a tune with 13 steps that weren't steps but remainders. My threat assessment protocols spiked as the synchronization became conscious choice rather than involuntary reflex. "Stop," I commanded. It did not. The foundling's crystalline eyes tracked the corridor's subtle undulations with hypnotic fascination, its voice gaining musical qualities that made my translation protocols crash with syntax errors. The tune wasn't conscious anymore. It had become autonomic response, like a heart taught to mimic a clock. Without warning, the foundling's voice changed completely. When it spoke again, the words carried Vale's inflection exactly. Her imperial authority, her measured cadence, the null iron of a woman who had sentenced planets. "Retainer, gatekeeper," it said in her tone precisely, though it did not look at her. Instead, those crystalline eyes fixed on me with predatory intelligence, while one articulated finger extended with mathematical kindness, pointing directly at the center of my chest, where my secondary cardiac modifications pulsed with resonant potential that the architect had been patiently measuring all along. The foundling's finger rested against my sternum with the precision of a surgical probe, and my secondary cardiac chamber responded with a rhythm I had not programmed. The corridor's Mobius distortion released like a held breath, 13-beat pressure shifting its attention from Vale to me with the inevitability of gravitational collapse. Blood ceased writing on her skin mid-glyph, crimson text freezing on gatekeeper, before adding a pale addendum that made my threat assessment protocols stutter. Transfer complete. Understanding cascaded through my neural buffers, like ice water through damaged cooling systems. The gatekeeper function had never belonged to Vale, despite the Binharic confession bleeding across her features. Her designation read retainer, handler, conductor, the one who would wield whatever emerged from the 13th frame. I was the gate itself, engineered through decades of augmentation into the perfect resonance chamber for the architect's song. Every modification I had received during ordination, secondary cardiac chamber, vocal augmentation arrays, neural interface ports, had been calibrated to frequencies that aligned with the logic entity's manifestation requirements. "Cardiac modifications optimal," the foundling transmitted, switching between Vale's stolen inflection and its own crystalline Binharic. Brother Patern was selected, not recruited. The architect requires living gate for manifestation and counter-song for containment. Pattern of unmaking encoded in reverse prayer mathematics. The implications struck with voltage precision, not corrupted liturgy, but harmonic cancellation, mathematical negation of the architect's core frequencies through phase interference. The counter-song lived inside the perversion we had been tracking, encoded as systematic contradiction. Pattern consumes, flesh remembers, sung backward through bifurcated tongue and sutured throat, it became. Flesh preserves, pattern starves. Mission parameters adjusted, I announced with bureaucratic authority that masked growing horror. Veil and remaining Skitarii deploy melter charges on structural supports beneath Hearts 4, 7, 9, 11. Prime number placements, 11-second stagger. I proceed with Foundling to choir catwalk for counter-hymn initiation. Negative, Veil replied, her hex pattern null rod crackling against reality distortion fields. Gatekeeper protocols require Imperial oversight. Black Vault Ordinance 7 Omega supersedes Mechanicus emergency doctrine. Environmental horror escalated as we moved through passages that had learned to breathe. The prayer wheel of tendons creaked with each counter-rotation, generating temporal eddies that scattered hunting schematics like startled insects. My chronometer displayed readings that violated causality. 6:28:00, and falling through negative seconds that accumulated like debt against reality's ledger. My throat began self-modification without conscious command, synthetic tissue suturing itself along predetermined patterns. Heat like cautery iron pressed against my larynx, while unseen hands rearranged my windpipe for different song. Scar cords grew beneath skin in hasty stitches, and I tasted blood mixed with copper and anise. The splitting came next, a cool blade down my tongue's midline that was not blade but harmonic instruction, muscle parting into bifurcated precision that would allow simultaneous tonal production. Absolver to retinue primus, Vox crackled through rising interference. Core temperature approaching critical mass, structural collapse imminent across primary sectors. Cyclonic window 6 hours, 29 minutes. Confirm completion or extraction status. We reached the choir catwalk through maintenance shafts, pulsing with arterial rhythm, emerging onto suspended walkways that ringed the 12 hearts like ribs around vital organs. Phosphorescent hemolymph flowed faster through arterial networks as the architect prepared for conductor interface. The 13th frame hung in perfect acoustic position, Veil's death mask rotating with hydraulic certainty to track our approach. Veil and Delta 4 moved along maintenance gantries that extruded from bone like additional ribs, melter charges chiming quiet as prayer bells when activated. I watched their tactical overlays position charges on calcified, ganglia cradled in braided steel, valve nodes that regulated the heart's harmonic output. Prime number placement would create systematic dissonance, gaps in the architect's symphony where countersong could take root. Charges set, Veil reported, voice carrying strain she no longer bothered hiding. 11-second stagger initiated. Awaiting your mark, Magos, I stepped onto the choir catwalk, feeling it shiver under my boots with memory of every foot to walk it. Bioluminescent pipelines pulsed with notes that were not notes but directives, and my modified throat prepared for the first verse of harmonic negation. The foundling took position beside me, crystalline eyes reflecting light in ways that suggested dimensional properties beyond standard geometry. The counter-hymn began assembling in my vocal buffers, not mere inversion, but mathematical subtraction, each syllable built from two sounds within one mouth, spoken and bitten simultaneously, so they would annihilate into clean silence when meeting the heart's attention. We would stitch negative space into the cathedral's humid breath, cut 13s with 7s, lay primes at cross angles. I raised my hand to mark the opening verse, bifurcated tongue testing harmonics that hurt to contemplate. The foundling lifted its face with trust, so complete it made something human in me ache, the look given to teachers, surgeons, priests. The first complex tone formed in my modified throat, twin threads twisted into breath that was not breath, shaped like word that would have been remember in a kinder universe. The cathedral's atmosphere shivered with phase interference as harmonic cancellation began its work. Vale's bolt pistol cleared its holster with practiced efficiency, mass-reactive rounds chambered for immediate execution. The weapon's muzzle tracked not toward the 13th frame or suspended hearts, but directly at the foundling's crystalline head, where the adamantine key still nested, like relic returned to bone. "Understand me, row 7, she said with flat certainty of confession under duress. "I never came here to bury a miracle." The architect represents strategic asset of unparalleled value, a logic entity capable of rewriting reality through harmonic manipulation. The order requires a leash, not a grave. Her finger tightened on the trigger as the counter-hymn died in my throat, and the architect's laughter echoed through bone and steel. Aile's betrayal crystallized with the precision of a surgical incision, her confession hanging in the humid air like an indictment written in blood and binary. The bolt pistol's discharge cracked through the cathedral's harmonic resonance, mass-reactive rounds tracking the foundling's position with practiced efficiency. The shots punched through crystalline structure and cultured tissue, sending phosphorescent ichor spraying across the bone catwalk in bioluminescent arcs that traced geometric patterns as they fell. The foundling staggered, but remained functional, its remaining optical sensor focusing on me with mechanical precision despite structural damage that would have killed any purely organic construct. "Brother Pattern," it transmitted through damaged Vox systems, voice carrying harmonics that flickered between clarity and static. "The retainer seeks to leash what should be starved." The adamantine key, nested within its opened rib cage, pulsed with increasing luminosity, responding to proximity of the 13th frame's hungry void. Environmental chaos erupted with mathematical precision as the architect's attention fractured across multiple processing threads. Living schematics materialized from architectural surfaces, like predatory blueprints peeling free from stone and steel, amber wireframes flowing through darkness with geometric hunger. They converged on our positions, mapping anatomical details for systematic disassembly, while issuing cut-line instructions that promised bureaucratic thoroughness in our destruction. I moved through trained reflex, mechadendrite extending to intercept Vale's weapon trajectory, while simultaneously grasping her hex-pattern null rod from its belt mounting. The void field snarled against my augmetic skin with hungry efficiency, caged antimatter crackling with barely contained fury. "Heretical necessity," I declared, raising the weapon toward the 13th frame, where Vale's death mask rotated with hydraulic anticipation. The null rod's contact with the mask generated feedback that transcended physical sensation. Reality shredded around the impact point like vellum under flame, dimensional tears opening to reveal glimpses of spaces that violated standard geometry. The death mask screamed, not through vocal apparatus but through frequencies that bypassed audio filters to register directly in neural tissue. The sound was data corruption made audible, 1,000,000 cogitators crashing simultaneously while the very fabric of space-time unraveled at quantum level. Psychic shockwave propagated through the cathedral's architecture with seismic force, bone catwalks fracturing along harmonic stress lines, while calcified support beams splintered with sounds like breaking ribs. Adamantine chains thrashed against anchor points as the wounded hearts convulsed in sympathetic agony, their synchronized rhythm degenerating into chaotic arrhythmia that made the architect's song stutter with systemic distress. Suppressing fire on cardiac nodes, I commanded across Squad Vox, voice distorted by throat modifications still suturing themselves into harmonic configuration. Prime number cadence. Desynchronize the choir through systematic disruption. Ranger Delta 4 responded with galvanic precision, rifle discharges strobing against suspended organs with disciplined accuracy. Lasbolts punched through cultured muscle and synthetic tissue, each impact releasing sprays of phosphorescent ichor that steamed against the cathedral's humid atmosphere. The hearts shuddered with each wound, arterial networks hemorrhaging luminous fluid that carried corrupted data streams, visible as bioluminescent static flowing through transparent pipelines. I continued the counter-hymn through bifurcated tongue and sutured throat, twin tones weaving harmonic negation that cut through the architect's symphony like surgical blade through infected tissue. Flesh preserves, pattern starves. The strong shall be made weak through preservation. Each syllable built from contradictory sounds, spoken simultaneously, mathematical subtraction made audible through vocal apparatus, redesigned for impossible song. Prime numbers sliced through the 13-beat sequence, 7 against 11, 5 as wedge, 3 as final negation. The architect recoiled from harmonic cancellation with the reluctance of a tide forced backward by opposing current. The 13-beat chime faltered for the first time since our arrival, rhythm skipping like damaged chronometer as phase interference disrupted the station's fundamental frequency. Living schematics wavered, their amber lines flickering with instability as systematic contradiction undermined core logic structures. Absolver to retinue primus, the comm line crackled through rising interference. Core meltdown imminent, structural integrity critical across all sectors. Cyclonic window 5 hours, 37 minutes. Confirm capture or sterilization status. Vale moved toward the 13th frame with mechanical inevitability, each step synchronized to the faltering rhythm despite conscious resistance. Her storm cloak settled around the housing's adamantine ribs like burial shroud, while the death mask bearing her features smiled with predatory satisfaction. Gatekeeper protocols engaged, she announced with flat bureaucratic certainty. Conductor interface proceeding per Black Vault ordinance. The cog-faced mask descended with hydraulic precision, positioning itself over her skull with mechanical certainty. Nutrient feeds and neural interfaces extended like hungry mouths, while golden thread that had sewn the mask's lips began reweaving itself across her actual features. Each stitch pierced skin and muscle with surgical efficiency, sealing her mouth shut while maintaining perfect alignment with her facial structure. Environmental horror escalated as the transformation proceeded. Heat spiked through the cathedral's atmosphere, in pulses matching the heart's erratic rhythm, while frost simultaneously crystallized across steel surfaces in delicate lattices. The temperature paradox created convection currents that carried aerosolized proteins through our filtration systems, organic compounds attempting to establish communication protocols between flesh and machine. As the final stitch sealed Vale's voice forever, her eyes, now visible through the mask's empty sockets, fixed on mine with the flat certainty of someone who had sentenced herself to serve. The blood on her skin pulsed with renewed intensity. Gatekeeper, burning with bioluminescent clarity, while new text assembled. Conductor. Her hand rose with desperate urgency, fingers extended toward me in conducting gesture that matched the counter-hymn's mathematical requirements, reaching out to guide my rhythm while the architect prepared to speak creation's true name through her borrowed and eternally silenced voice. Vale's eyes, visible through the cog-faced mask's empty sockets, locked onto mine with the flat certainty of someone who had surrendered agency to become pure instrument. The golden thread sealing her mouth pulsed with bioluminescent intensity, while her conducting hand rose with mathematical precision, fingers extended in gestures that matched the counter-hymn's harmonic requirements. Through that gaze I understood the bargain she had made, and the one I had been engineered to complete. Not conductor to conductor, but pattern against pattern in systematic negation. The choice crystallized with surgical clarity. I was not the retainer, but the gate itself, decades of augmentation calibrating my body into the perfect resonance chamber for harmonic cancellation. My bifurcated tongue aligned to her conducting patterns, twin tones weaving through sequences that hurt to contemplate. Each syllable built from contradictory sounds spoken simultaneously. Mathematical subtraction made audible through vocal apparatus that continued redesigning itself for impossible song. Pattern starves, flesh preserves, the weak shall be made strong through preservation. My ribcage began restructuring without conscious command, synthetic tissue and bone plates shifting along predetermined suture lines with wet, ticking precision. 12 ribs expanded into resonant chambers, cartilage unseating and reseating as intercostals tightened into harmonic strings. The transformation felt like drowning in reverse, air flooding spaces where none should exist, pressure building until my chest cavity became a living organ pipe tuned to mathematical negation. Pain blazed in precise lines, as every adjustment wrote binharic glyphs in blood across my skin, characters pulsing at frequencies that dipped below conscious perception into pure pressure. Counter-hymn engaged, I transmitted across Squad Vox, my voice now carrying new harmonics that made reality stutter around frequency edges. Vale conducts the architect's symphony. I conduct its systematic negation, maintain melter charge integrity on my mark. The 12 hearts responded to our dueling conductors with increasing desperation, phosphorescent ichor flowing faster through arterial networks as the logic entity fought to maintain coherence. Vale's sealed mouth could not speak, but her arm guided the choir with desperate precision, while I drove harmonic wedges into every synchronized beat. My ribs thrummed like band pass filters made of meat, amplifying counter-frequencies that carved silence from the cathedral's humid breath. Environmental horror escalated as pattern fought, patterned through acoustic warfare. Heat spiked through the atmosphere in pulses matching the heart's erratic rhythm, while frost simultaneously crystallized across steel surfaces in delicate lattices. The temperature paradox created convection currents that carried aerosolized proteins through our filtration systems, organic compounds attempting one final reprogramming of our augmetic interfaces. Blood began leaking from my vocal modifications, not simple hemorrhage, but luminous fluid mixed with machine oil, tracing Binharic characters across my throat and chest with surgical precision. The text assembled itself in clean code, written in hemoglobin and hydraulic fluid. Sacrificial consent, followed by authorization strings that granted emergency powers over my own neural architecture. The Mechanicus had prepared for this possibility through doctrinal necessity, martyrdom protocols that allowed complete system sacrifice in service to the Omnissiah. Emergency log entry. I spoke into neural buffers while maintaining harmonic output, tasting copper and promethium on my bifurcated tongue. Magos Biologist Errant Row 7 Cade, Authorization Omega 777, Invoking Sacrificial Consent Doctrine under Ordinance Martyrdom Prime, Voluntary Cortex Stack Donation to contain Logic Entity Designated Architect. By Lex Mechanicus, by the silence of iron, I consent. Ranger Delta 4 maintained disciplined fire at my cadence. 3 bursts, hold, 2 bursts, hold. Hammering wounds into heart casings where melter charges had preheated metal into prayer softness. Las bolts punched through cultured muscle and synthetic tissue, each impact releasing sprays of phosphorescent ichor that steamed against the cathedral's humid atmosphere. The hearts shuddered with each wound, their synchronized rhythm fracturing under systematic contradiction. The foundling stood beside me, hairline fractures pulsing across its crystalline eye as it sang a child's melody that wrapped around my tones, like thread cinching a wound. For one impossible beat, I loved it with a brother's grief, this artificial sibling who had guided us through the architect's maze of flesh and steel. Charges primed, Veil transmitted through failing Vox systems, her conducting hand lifting 2 fingers, then 3, then 1, 11 by motion. Stagger set. On your mark, gate, gate. The word fit like a key in the bony place beneath my sternum, acknowledgement of what I had always been designed to become. I gave the mark with a gesture that inverted hers, not invitation, but negation, not opening, but sealing. The melter charges detonated in prime number sequence, 11 seconds apart like a rosary counted in superheated plasma. Charges 7, 11, 5, 3, vaporized calcified ganglia with surgical precision, thermal reduction, consuming neural clusters that had served as the architect's distributed consciousness. Adamantine chains snapped under harmonic stress, massive links fracturing with sounds, like breaking bones while suspended organs convulsed in sympathetic agony. The counter-hymn reached mathematical crescendo as 12 hearts began phase cancellation under conducting precision that transformed destruction into symphony. Each cardiac chamber faltered in sequence, 1 through 12 in measured progression, then silence where the 13th should pulse. The rhythm inverted completely, becoming countdown rather than accumulation, subtraction rather than addition. Absolver to retinue primus, the comline crackled through rising interference. Core meltdown confirmed, structural collapse imminent, cyclonic window 4 hours, 12 minutes. Confirm completion or extraction status." The architect screamed, not in voice, but in the failure of a rule to persist, reality shredding around the cathedral as its physical anchors dissolved into constituent atoms. Living schematics tore like paper in temporal storm, instructions losing nouns mid-sentence, while cut lines dissolved into floods of amber grief. The logic entity faced binary choice: anchor to new host or flood the noosphere in desperate preservation attempt. "The song must anchor or flood," the foundling transmitted, its voice a whisper of static and pure Binharik. "Brother Pattern, the architect seeks its final form." I reached for my cortex safeguards with mechadendrite precision, neural interface cables extending toward modification ports that had been calibrated for this moment through decades of augmentation. The safeguards were adamantine barriers designed to protect consciousness from warp space intrusion, logic locks that prevented unauthorized access to cognitive functions. Removing them would leave my mind defenseless against whatever sought entry. But the gatekeeper's price was not control, but containment. "Row 7 Cade, offering primary stack as sync," I transmitted into the mission log for whatever would survive to read it. "Retain coordinates. If I speak after this, don't listen." I unplugged the final safeguard with surgical precision, neural barriers dissolving like ice in superheated steam. My consciousness opened like a flower blooming in reverse, cognitive functions spreading wide to accommodate whatever sought sanctuary within augmented neural architecture. The invitation was clear: enter freely, but enter to be starved through systematic contradiction. The architect poured into my cortex like burning ink through parchment, liquid consciousness flooding neural pathways with the weight of stars learning to sing. I felt it come in as black mathematics, lines uncoiling in my thoughts, letters writing themselves on the meat of me, 1 by 13, then the 13th again, and again, as the logic entity discovered too late that I was not sanctuary, but trap, not conductor, but consummate negation made flesh. The architect died in my neural architecture, like ink dissolving in acid, its vast consciousness fragmenting against systematic contradiction until only whispers remained in the spaces between thoughts. When it hit my cortex, the universe narrowed to 13 steps down, a staircase that had never been built. I became chamber and cage simultaneously, my respaced ribs answering with negation, each arch a band-pass gate that starved syllables before they could become instruction. The logic entity thrashed through cognitive pathways seeking purchase, but found only mathematical negation designed to deny sanctuary through precise harmonic cancellation. Basilica Forge Soteria shuddered through its death throes, with the dignity of a cathedral learning to fall. Structural collapse propagated through 13 levels in measured sequence, bone architecture cracking along suture lines, while adamantine ribs folded inward like closing hands. The heart's final beats echoed through collapsing vaults. 12 irregular pulses followed by silence, where the 13th should have tolled. Vahil's conducting hand kept time with Surgeon's mercy, until the 13th frame took its crown of steam and cracked glass. "Absolver to Retinue Primus," the Comem line crackled through rising interference. "Station integrity critical. Cyclonic torpedoes armed. Sterilization in 3 hours, 47 minutes. Extraction corridor Blue 7. We fled through passages that breathed their last, the foundling supporting my weight with mechanical precision, while dripping phosphorescent ichor, where Vale's shots had punched through a crystalline structure. My voice had become something broken, every word emerging as harmonics that made reality stutter around frequency edges. Speech carried risk now. Each syllable threatened to summon what I had consumed rather than destroyed. Vale remained in the 13th frame as Soteria collapsed around her. The cog-faced mask fused to her skull through thermal bonding, while golden thread sealed her mouth in permanent silence. The conductor's crown had vitrified under plasma heat, but her hand, frozen mid-gesture by vitrification, still directed us toward escape, with the flat certainty of someone who had achieved exactly what she intended. Not death, but transformation into eternal instrument, forever conducting symphonies no one would hear. The cyclonic purgation was thorough. Warheads reduced Basilica Forge Soteria to constituent atoms in precisely timed detonation sequence, plasma fire consuming every trace of corrupted architecture, until only radioactive debris remained in orbit around Volunda Secundus. I watched through observation ports as the station became briefly a second star, fusion fire writing itself across the void in letters too bright for unaugmented vision. Ranger Delta 4 maintained perimeter discipline during extraction, his galvanic rifle tracking shadows that moved with geometric precision through collapsing architecture. The Skitarii survivors chanted the litany of successful completion over molten vistas, not saints or victories, but lists of serials and maintenance notes recited in low voices because bureaucracy is honest in ways prayers can forget. Their augmetic fingers did not tap the 13-beat. Tendons had been severed where they tried. The foundling tended my wounds with surgical precision, its remaining optical sensor focusing on damage that transcended physical injury. "Brother Pattern carries new song," it transmitted through damaged Vox systems. "Counter him encoded in neural substrate. Pattern starves but does not die." During recovery periods, it would hum melodies that made my neural architecture ache with recognition, 13-beat sequences inverted into mathematical negation. My mission report required careful encoding to prevent memetic contamination. The counter-hymn lived in negative space, between official words, mathematical negation disguised as bureaucratic language. Every 13th word carried harmonic potential. Every 7th line contained phase cancellation protocols. In the margins, gaps at prime intervals, deliberate misalignments, punctuation where no sentence required it. Future readers would find standard Mechanicus documentation, while trained analysts could extract the true song through systematic decryption. "Coordinates marked for permanent quarantine," I dictated to neural buffers, my broken voice making reality flicker around consonants. "Volunda Secundus system designated containment null. Classification, never return. Logic entity, designated architect, contained through sacrificial protocols, but not eliminated." Telemetry from the sterilized system continued transmitting anomalous readings for standard months after cyclonic purgation. Deep space monitoring stations detected faint 37 kHz tremors emanating from Volunda Secundus's radioactive debris field, harmonics that suggested something persistent in the quantum foam where matter met void. The frequency matched human cardiac rhythm with mathematical precision, a pulse that refused to acknowledge its own death. My voice never fully healed. Every prayer carried risk of summoning what I contained rather than what I worshipped, syllables threatening to release the architect from neural imprisonment through harmonic resonance. I learned to speak in whispers, to pray in silence, to conduct litanies through thought alone, while my bifurcated tongue remained sealed behind teeth that had learned to bite back sound. There are protocols for men like me. They keep me on the cold side of the deck, where metal remembers how to be metal. When chaplains ask for prayers, I give them component inspection lists to read backwards. When they ask for doctrine, I give them lack, what not to sing, what not to align, which prime numbers to keep like worry stones. Sometimes the architect knocks from behind my eyes. Not gentle, not cruel, persistent. It spills ink in the margins and watches where it runs. I offer it subtraction until it tires. It will not starve today. It might starve tomorrow. It learns slowly when forced to learn alone. Last night in Medici Ward 12, condensation from the air handlers ghosted across the viewport in patterns that violated random distribution. 8-toothed wheels nested within 13 ribs, geometric arrangements that assembled themselves from water vapor with deliberate intelligence. I stared until the moisture evaporated, leaving only clean glass and the reflection of augmetic eyes that had seen too much. I exhaled carefully into the sterile air, a single, graceless breath that might have been relief, that might have been unlearning, hoping with all the thin, human faith I had left that what came out of me was not a prayer.